They say that on the day they strapped Floyd Allen into the electric chair, the mountains of Carroll County held their breath. Here was a man who had been a law unto himself, a patriarch whose word was gospel and whose pistol was the final court of appeal. He was a king in his own world, a world of misty hollers and unwritten codes of honor. Yet his reign ended not in a blaze of glory on a mountainside, but in a sterile room in Richmond, at the hands of a power he could never understand. Was he the last of the mountain lions, a fierce protector of his kin, cornered by a world that no longer had a place for him? Or was he a brutal tyrant, a man whose pride was so vast it consumed everything he loved, his family, his fortune, and finally, his own life? The truth, as it always does in these old hills, is tangled up like roots in the clay. Today, we're going to untangle that story. We're going to follow the trail of blood and honor that led Floyd Allen from the pinnacle of power in his mountain kingdom to that cold chair in the state penitentiary. And to do that, we have to start not with the famous massacre that sealed his fate, but with the forgotten gunfight 4 years earlier, the day the Allens shot up a courthouse and walked away, convinced they were invincible. Floyd Allen was not born a killer. He was born a king. His kingdom was the mist-shrouded hills and dark, winding hollers of Carroll County, Virginia, a world forged in the cold creeks and rocky soil of the Blue Ridge. In the late 19th century, this wasn't just a place on a map. It was a fortress of self-reliance, sealed off from the outside world by poor roads and a deep-seated suspicion of flatlanders and their laws. Here, a man's name was his legacy, and the Allen name carried the weight of generations of hard work, hard-headedness, and a fierce, unyielding loyalty to their own. His father, and his father before him, had taught him the only lessons that mattered. You didn't learn your worth in a schoolhouse, you learned it behind a plow, with an axe in your hand, or by looking another man in the eye during a land deal. The Allens were not poor. They were landowners, farmers, and businessmen who built their prosperity with their own sweat and ingenuity. Floyd learned early that wealth and influence were earned, and once earned, they had to be defended. Not with lawyers and contracts, but with a firm handshake for a friend and a cold stare for an enemy. Life in those mountains was a constant struggle, a teacher of hard truths. A failed crop could mean a hungry winter. A sudden sickness could be a death sentence without a doctor for miles. You learned to depend on two things, your own strength and the strength of your kin. When a neighbor's barn burned, it wasn't the government that showed up to help, it was the community. And when trouble came looking for you, it wasn't a sheriff you called, it was your brothers and your cousins. This forged an unbreakable bond within the clan and a permanent wall against the outside world, which they saw as weak, meddlesome, and utterly untrustworthy. There's an old story, perhaps a legend, about a young Floyd Allen watching his father deal with a dispute over a timber boundary. A man from outside the county arrived with a deed from the courthouse in Richmond, waving the paper as if it were a holy scripture. He claimed the Allens had been cutting on his land. Floyd's father didn't even look at the document. He just looked at the man and said, "I know my line, and you know my line. That paper doesn't know this mountain." He stood his ground, unblinking, until the man with the deed folded it up and left. The lesson for young Floyd was seared into his soul. A man's spine was worth more than his signature, and the only true law was the one a man was willing to enforce himself. From this upbringing, Floyd Allen carried with him a code as rigid and unforgiving as the mountains themselves. First, your blood was your nation. An offense against one Allen was a declaration of war on them all. Second, your honor was your most valuable possession. An insult left unanswered was a stain that could never be washed away. Third, you stood on your own 2 feet. You solved your own problems, you fought your own battles, and you never, ever bowed your head to an outsider trying to tell you how to live on your own land. This was the world that created Floyd Allen, and he, in turn, became its perfect embodiment. He was industrious, proud, and quick to anger, But he was also known for his generosity and unwavering loyalty to those he considered his own. He wasn't just a man living by the mountain code, he was the mountain code, walking and breathing. And he was walking straight toward a collision with a modern world that had no room for kings like him. Long before the newspapers in Richmond painted him as a monster, Floyd Allen was simply the most important man in his corner of the world. He was a man built like a barrel, solid and immovable, with eyes that could measure a man's worth in a single glance. When he walked into a room, the conversation didn't stop, but it changed. People straightened up. They knew they were in the presence of someone who mattered, a man whose favor could make you and whose anger could break you. He wasn't just a farmer scratching a living from the dirt. He was an empire builder in miniature. He owned some of the best land in Carroll County, acres of it, cleared and farmed with meticulous care. He ran a general store that was the hub of the community, a place where news was traded over barrels of crackers and bolts of cloth. He was a shrewd businessman who always seemed to be one step ahead, whether he was buying timber, trading livestock, or, as some whispered, running a profitable line in the untaxed corn liquor that warmed the mountain winters. He had built a small fortune through grit and intelligence, and he provided well for his own. But his influence went far beyond money. Floyd Allen was the unofficial law in his part of the county. If a dispute arose between neighbors over a stray cow or a poorly marked property line, more often than not, they wouldn't ride to the courthouse in Hillsville. They'd ride to Floyd Allen's porch. He would listen to both sides, his face unreadable, and then he would deliver his verdict. And his verdict was final. There was no appeal because everyone knew Floyd Allen had the will and the means to enforce his own judgments. To many, this wasn't tyranny. It was justice, swift, understandable, and delivered by one of their own. To truly understand the man, though, you have to look past the businessman and the enforcer. You have to see him at his own dinner table, surrounded by his wife and children, his brothers and their families. Here, the hard gaze softened. He was the undisputed patriarch, the head of the clan, but his rule was built on a foundation of fierce, protective love. His family was his fortress, the living, breathing heart of the world he had built. Every acre he bought, every dollar he earned, every enemy he made, it was all in service of protecting them. He was the sentinel on the walls of that fortress. This was the world Floyd Allen had built, a self-contained kingdom carved out of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a world of order, his order, built on loyalty, respect, and the quiet understanding that his authority was absolute. It was a peaceful kingdom, a safe harbor for his kin, and he would do absolutely anything to protect it from the encroaching world he saw as a threat to everything he held dear. But for all his strength, for all the respect he commanded, Floyd Allen was a man with a crack in his foundation. It was a flaw as deep and as unyielding as the mountain granite itself, a pride so absolute, so all-consuming, that it bordered on a kind of personal sovereignty. He didn't just think he was right. He believed in his bones that his will was the only true law. This wasn't simple arrogance. It was the conviction of a king who genuinely could not comprehend any authority higher than his own. They tell a story in Carroll County about a revenue agent who came up from Richmond one year, a young man full of ink and importance, carrying a list of new taxes. He found Floyd on his porch and began to explain the new regulations in a condescending tone, as if speaking to a simple child of the hills. Floyd listened patiently, his face a mask. When the agent was finished, Floyd didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the man and said, "Your papers have no meaning on this land. You can take them, and yourself, back down the mountain you came up." The agent tried to protest, to invoke the power of the state, but he saw something in Floyd Allen's eyes that told him the conversation was over. That kind of pride, that unshakable belief in his own domain, was a force of nature. For years, this very flaw had been his greatest strength. It was pride that drove him to outwork every man around him, to turn rocky fields into profitable farms. It was pride that made him a man of his word, because the thought of his reputation being tarnished was intolerable. It was the source of the fierce loyalty he showed his kin. An insult to them was an insult to him, and his pride would not let that stand. He built his entire world on the principle of never backing down, never bending a knee. But this strength cast a long and dangerous shadow. It made him utterly blind to the changing world. He saw every legal summons, every warrant, every tax notice, not as the impersonal functioning of a government, but as a direct and personal challenge to his honor from a rival power. He couldn't distinguish between a man who insulted his family and a judge who issued a lawful order. To Floyd Allen, they were one and the same, an outside force trying to impose its will on his kingdom. This inability to bend, this refusal to acknowledge any law but his own, was a tragic flaw of classical proportions. It was a ticking clock, counting down to a day when he would be faced with a choice he was incapable of making. A day when the state would demand he submit, and his pride would demand he resist. A confrontation was not just likely, it was written in the very soul of the man. And that confrontation would be the engine of the entire tragedy to come. The spark that would eventually burn down the Allen dynasty was not some grand crime, no bloody murder or daring robbery. It was a piece of paper, a simple indictment from the Grayson County Court. The target wasn't even Floyd, but his brother, Sidney Allen, a man as proud and respected as any in the clan. The charge? Carrying a concealed weapon. To the state of Virginia, it was a misdemeanor. To the Allens, it was like charging a blacksmith for owning a hammer. In their world, a pistol was a tool of survival and a symbol of manhood, and the law had no business telling a free man what he could or could not carry. But this was more than a dispute over a law. It was personal. The Allens had been in a long, simmering feud with the local deputy, Mabe Poole. They saw his hand in this, believing the badge was being used as a weapon to settle old scores and chip away at their influence. The arrest of Sidney was not seen as impartial justice. It was seen as targeted harassment by their enemies. To Floyd Allen, this summons wasn't a legal document. It was a glove slapped across his face, a public challenge to his family's honor and his own authority as the clan's protector. His pride, that immense and fragile thing, could not let such a public effrontery stand. There was no talk of hiring a fancy lawyer from Richmond. The Allens' response was primal and immediate. They would answer the summons, but on their own terms. On the day of the trial in 1908, a formidable delegation of the Allen clan rode into the town of Independence. They weren't coming to plead for mercy. They were coming to make a statement. Floyd, Sidney, and their hot-headed young nephew Wesley Edwards led the way. They were armed, their faces were grim, and they moved with the cold confidence of men who believed they were their own highest law. The courtroom itself became a stage for this clash of worlds. On one side sat Judge Thornton Massey, the Commonwealth's attorney, and the handful of deputies who represented the fragile authority of the state. On the other, the Allens sat together, a silent, unmoving block of defiance. They were an island of mountain code in an ocean of common law. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the unspoken knowledge that the legal proceedings were just a formality, a prelude to a confrontation that had been brewing for years. The trial was a quick affair. The verdict came back as everyone expected: guilty. When that word echoed through the courtroom, it was more than a legal finding. It was a declaration of victory by the state over the clan. It was the law of the flatlands telling Floyd Allen, in his own territory, that his power meant nothing within these four walls. For a man whose entire identity was built on never backing down, on being the ultimate authority, this public humiliation was the unforgivable affront. It was the point of no return. The time for talk was over. In the heavy silence that followed the verdict, the world seemed to shrink to the four walls of that courtroom. For any other man, this was the moment to negotiate, to mitigate, to swallow his pride and pay the fine. A quiet word from a lawyer, a nod of acceptance to the judge, These were the off-ramps back to a peaceful life. The court itself offered these paths. Judge Massey was known to be a reasonable man. The sentence for a first offense of this nature would likely have been little more than a token fine, a slap on the wrist to assert the law's authority. But Floyd Allen did not see a row of open doors. He saw a line of bayonets. Every aspect of the legal process was, in his eyes, another link in a chain being forged to bind him. The clerk's scratching pen, the jury's averted eyes, the judge's solemn face, these were not instruments of justice, but weapons of humiliation. You could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his gaze never left the judge's bench. He was not a defendant awaiting a sentence. He was a king staring down a usurper. Some accounts say that even Sidney Allen, the man at the center of it all, hesitated. He was a practical man, and perhaps he saw the futility of this confrontation. A fine was just money after all. A few days in jail would be an inconvenience, not the end of the world. He might have been willing to bend, to give the law its small victory and live to fight another day. But he, like everyone else in the Allen clan, looked to Floyd. And Floyd's face was carved from stone. His pride had taken the wheel, and it recognized no road but the one that led straight ahead. The young men, especially the hot-blooded Wesley Edwards, took their cue from the patriarch. They saw his unyielding stance not as stubbornness, but as courage. They saw his cold fury as righteous anger. Floyd's rejection of compromise was a silent command to them all. We do not break. We do not bow. If Floyd Allen had shown the slightest sign of submission, his kin would have followed. But he showed none. His decision, made in the silent furnace of his own pride, sealed the fate of everyone in that room. Each tick of the clock was a step further down the path of no return. The opportunity for a quiet resolution vanished. The chance for a grudging acceptance evaporated. The air grew thinner, charged with an invisible current of violence. The Allens were no longer just a family in legal trouble. They had become a powder keg, and Floyd Allen's pride was the lit fuse. By refusing to accept the court's authority, he had rejected all possibility of peace. He had made his choice, not with words, but with a glare of pure, undiluted defiance. He had decided that the Allen law was the only law that mattered, and he was prepared to prove it. The moment the guilty verdict was read, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom. This was it, the final crossroads. All that stood between the Allen clan and open warfare was the sentence from Judge Thornton Massey. And in that moment, the judge, perhaps sensing the electric tension in the room, seemed to extend one last fragile bridge back to the world of reason. He rapped his gavel once, a sound like a cracking bone, and prepared to speak. He could have thrown the book at Sidney Allen. He could have imposed a heavy fine and a long jail sentence to make an example of him. But instead, the words he spoke were measured, designed to de-escalate. He pronounced the sentence, a fine and a short term in the county jail. Some accounts even claim the jail time was suspended. It was a token punishment, a symbolic victory for the state that would allow the Allens to pay a pittance and walk away with their freedom intact. It was the law's final, surprisingly fair offer. It was the last chance for peace. For a long, agonizing second, that offer hung in the air. The whole world seemed to pause, waiting on one man. Everyone, from the nervous deputies to the Allens themselves, turned their eyes to Floyd. He didn't have to say a word. His face was the weather vane that would show which way the storm would break. He could have reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and ended the whole affair. He could have swallowed his pride just for a moment and saved everything. It was the logical choice, the sane choice. But as Floyd Allen stood there, he wasn't weighing a fine against his freedom. He was weighing submission against his very soul. In his mind, paying that fine was no different than kneeling before a conquering king. It was an admission that the law of the courthouse was stronger than the law of the clan. It was a public branding of his family as subservient. And his pride, that fierce and terrible master, screamed that death was better than such a dishonor. And so, in that final moment, he made his choice. He didn't shout or draw his weapon. The signal was far more chilling. He met the eyes of his nephew, the volatile Wesley Edwards, and gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was a silent, final verdict, delivered not by the judge, but by the patriarch. The verdict was war. The last door to peace had just been slammed shut and locked from the inside. As Judge Massey's words faded, the air in the courtroom became as thin as a winter razor. Then, from the Allen side of the room, a chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Young Wesley Edwards was on his feet, his face a mask of pure fury. His voice, cracking with youthful rage, cut through the tension like a thrown knife. "I'll see you in hell," he roared, "before Sidna Allen goes to jail." It was not a plea or a threat. It was a declaration of war. In that instant, the world for Floyd Allen slowed to a crawl. He saw a deputy, Mabe Poole or another man like him, take a single fateful step towards Sidna. It was a small movement, but in the supercharged atmosphere of the room, it was an act of aggression, a hand reaching out to put a chain on a king. The sound of his own heart hammered in his ears, a deep, steady drumbeat counting down the final seconds of peace. His hand, as if with a mind of its own, found the familiar cold weight of the pistol under his coat. A single sharp crack shattered the stillness. It wasn't a boom, but a sound as clean and final as a closing coffin lid. For a heartbeat, there was only the ringing echo. Then the courtroom exploded. It was a deafening, blinding chaos. Blinks of orange fire lit the suddenly dim room as more shots answered the first. The air filled with a thick, choking grey smoke from the black powder, smelling of sulfur and damnation. Women screamed, a high, thin sound that was quickly swallowed by the deeper roar of men's shouts and the splintering of wood as heavy benches overturned. Through the swirling smoke, the world was a series of terrifying snapshots. Judge Massey, the very symbol of the law, vanished from his high bench as if swallowed by the earth, scrambling for cover. Men who had moments before been instruments of the state were now just men, diving behind tables, their faces pale with shock. The courtroom, a temple of order, had been transformed into a smoky, claustrophobic battlefield where survival was the only law left. But the Allens were not panicking. They were a single organism, moving with a cold, terrifying purpose. They rose as one, not to flee, but to fight their way out. They formed a bristling line of steel and defiance, a human wall that no one dared to cross. Each man covered the other, their movements honed by a lifetime of absolute trust. They were not a mob, they were a clan. And in that moment of pure violence, they were magnificent and terrible. The few deputies in the room were outmanned, outgunned, and utterly outmatched by this unified front of cold fury. The storm of noise lasted for what felt like an eternity, but it was likely only a minute. As quickly as it began, it subsided. The last shot echoed, and a profound, ringing silence descended upon the room. The air was a thick, unbreathable fog, heavy with the metallic tang of burnt powder. The argument that had started with a piece of paper was suddenly, permanently over. Through the haze, Floyd Allen saw the wreckage of the law's authority, and he knew they had won. The thick grey smoke began to clear, not on a scene of carnage, but on a scene of absolute victory. Floyd Allen stood amidst the overturned benches and the lingering smell of gunpowder, his pistol still warm in his hand. He felt no remorse. Remorse was for men who made mistakes. He had made a choice, and he had enforced his will. He looked at his kin, Sidna, Wesley, the others, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes alight with the fire of battle. They were shaken, but unbroken. They were Allens. There was no thought of surrender, no consideration of waiting for the law to regroup. That would be admitting they had done something wrong. In Floyd's mind, they had done the only thing they could. He gave a sharp, curt nod to his brother. It was time to go. The business in this place was finished. They didn't run, they walked. With a slow, deliberate pace, the Allen clan strode out of the ruined courtroom, a phalanx of armed and dangerous men. Deputies and court officials, still dazed and disarmed by the suddenness of the assault, simply watched them go. No one dared to raise a hand to stop them. They moved through the panicked corridors and down the courthouse steps into the daylight, emerging into the gaping faces of the townsfolk who had gathered at the sound of the gunfire. Their path through the town of Independence was a corridor of fear and awe. People flattened themselves against walls, pulling their children back. The lawmen who were supposed to be the guardians of this town were nowhere to be seen, or they stood by, powerless and humiliated. The Allens walked straight to their horses, which were tied to a hitching post as if it were any other market day. There was no haste in their movements. They checked their saddles, mounted their horses, and gathered together in the middle of the street. For a final moment, Floyd Allen looked back at the courthouse, the symbol of the flatland law he so despised. It stood there, violated and silent. He had challenged it on its own ground, and he had won. He turned his horse without a word, and together the Allens rode out of town, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled back down on the defeated law. They were not fugitives fleeing into the wilderness. They were conquerors, returning to their mountain kingdom. The Allens rode home as heroes, their victory echoing through the hollers before they even reached their own land. To their kin and supporters, they were giants who had stared down the corrupt machinery of the state and made it blink. But this triumph was a poisoned chalice. While the men celebrated their defiance, the women of the clan now had to live with a new and constant dread. They had seen their husbands and sons ride off to a courthouse and return from a gunfight. From that day forward, every trip to town, every knock on the door, would carry the chilling possibility of reprisal. The victory at Independence didn't bring peace. It brought a permanent state of war. The community itself was fractured. You see, an event like this forces everyone to choose a side. There was no longer any middle ground. Families who had been neighbors for generations suddenly looked at each other with suspicion. You were either with the Allens and the old ways, or you were with the law and the future. Friendships soured, and old resentments flared into open hostility. The Commonwealth's attorney, Greer, nursed more than just a bullet wound in his arm. He nursed a grudge that would fester for years. The law had been publicly humiliated, and men like that have long memories. But the most dangerous ripple effect was on the law itself. Judge Thornton Massey was not a man to be cowed. The bullets that had scarred his courtroom had also hardened his resolve. The Allens had proven they were not just a difficult family, they were an armed insurrection against the very idea of a civilized society. For the judge and the prosecutors, the fight was no longer about a misdemeanor weapons charge. It was now an existential struggle for control of the mountains. They began to plan, to prepare, to ensure that the next time they faced the Allen clan in a courtroom, the state would not be the one to back down. The Allens' victory guaranteed that any future confrontation would be met with overwhelming force. The greatest wreckage, however, was invisible. It was the damage done to the minds of the next generation of Allens. The younger men, like Wesley Edwards, had learned a powerful and deadly lesson: that violence was a successful political tool. They had seen with their own eyes that a drawn pistol was more effective than any lawyer. This victory bred a fatal arrogance, a belief in their own invincibility. It erased any lingering respect for the institutions of the state and replaced it with contempt. They had shot their way out of trouble once, and now they believed they could do it again. So while Floyd Allen may have seen the events at Independence as a clean victory, the truth is that the gun smoke that filled that courtroom never truly cleared. It settled like a fine, toxic dust over the entire county, poisoning relationships, hardening hearts, and laying the groundwork for a far bloodier reckoning. The real tragedy of 1908 wasn't the gunfight itself, but the terrible future it made inevitable for everyone involved. After the Allens rode out of Independence, a strange and telling silence fell. There was no thundering posse, No call for the militia, no immediate cry for vengeance from the state. The reason was simple and stark. The local law enforcement had been completely and utterly broken. They had been outfought and humiliated on their own ground. To ride into the Allens' territory in the mountains of Carroll County would not have been a police action. It would have been a declaration of war, a war they knew they could not win. The law's first judgment, therefore, was a judgment of its own weakness. And so, the official trial of the Allen clan never truly happened. Instead, there was a series of quiet, face-saving maneuvers in back rooms. Warrants may have been issued, but they gathered dust. The Commonwealth's attorney, Mr. Greer, knew that serving them would cost more lives. In the end, the system blinked. The charges stemming from the riot were quietly dropped or settled with a small fine, likely paid by a third party, so that no Allen would have to suffer the indignity of paying it themselves. It was a humiliating whisper of a conclusion to a day that had roared with gunfire. The law, in essence, pretended it never happened. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was split right down the middle, cleaving the community in two. To the people of the mountains, to the families who lived by the same unwritten code, the Allens were heroes. They were seen as men who had refused to be harassed, who had defended their honor against a corrupt and alien system. The story of their victory was told around hearths and in general stores, growing more legendary with each telling. In this version, they were not criminals. They were martyrs to the cause of mountain independence. To the townspeople, the merchants, the lawyers, and the families connected to the court, the verdict was just as clear, but entirely different. To them, the Allens were savages. They were domestic terrorists who had desecrated the most sacred institution of civil society. They had replaced reasoned debate with brute force and the rule of law with the law of the gun. These people saw the Allens not as proud men, but as dangerous anarchists whose power had to be destroyed if the county was ever to move into the modern world. So, was justice served? By the standards of the state, it was a catastrophic failure. The law had been challenged by force and had retreated in disgrace. But by the standards of the Mountain Code, justice had been served perfectly. An insult had been answered, honor had been satisfied, and the clan's authority had been reinforced. The true verdict on the independence riot wasn't handed down by a judge or a jury. It was a verdict written in gunpowder and fear, and it declared, for all the world to see, that in these mountains, the Allen Code was still the supreme law of the land. What of the men who stood for the law that day? What became of the antagonists in this story? In the immediate aftermath, their fate was one of profound and public humiliation. Judge Thornton Massey had been forced to take cover behind his own bench. Commonwealth's Attorney Greer had been wounded. The deputies of Grayson County had been rendered utterly impotent, forced to watch as a gang of men shot up their courthouse and rode away untouched. For them, there was no justice, only the bitter taste of defeat. But if the Allens believed they had broken these men, they had made a grave miscalculation. They had not broken them. They had forged them into something harder and far more dangerous. Judge Massey did not resign or transfer to a quieter circuit. He stayed. The bullet holes in his courtroom were a daily reminder of the day his authority was shattered by gunfire. The experience didn't fill him with fear, it filled him with an iron resolve. For him, this was no longer a matter of law. It became a personal crusade to prove that the code of the courthouse was stronger than the code of the clan. He would get his chance 4 years later in a different courtroom facing the same family. The other players in this drama were similarly hardened. Greer's wounded arm eventually healed, but the insult to his office never did. The deputies who had been so easily overpowered learned a critical lesson. You do not bring a handful of men to a fight with the Allen clan. The entire legal establishment of the region, from sheriffs to prosecutors, understood that the next confrontation could not be a simple legal proceeding. It would have to be a show of overwhelming force. And so, the antagonists in this story did not meet some poetic justice. They did not wither away or disappear. Instead, they prospered and they planned. The Allens' victory and independence was the single greatest catalyst for their own destruction because it united all their enemies and gave them a common cause. They had won the battle, but in doing so, they had awakened a sleeping giant. The law had been bloodied, but now it was awake, and it was watching, and it was waiting for the one mistake that would give it the chance to settle the score once and for all. The 4 years that followed the independence riot were the high summer of the Allen clan's power. Their victory didn't just fade into memory, it became the foundation of their living legend. Floyd Allen's authority, already immense, became absolute. His name was spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence from one end of the county to the other. His porch was no longer just a place of business, it was a throne room. In this brief, tense period, the Allens were not just a powerful family, they were royalty, and their mountain kingdom had never seemed more secure. But this victory planted poison seeds in the next generation. For the young men of the clan, the sons and nephews who looked up to Floyd, the riot was their defining lesson. They saw that the law could be faced down, that pistols spoke louder than gavels. They carried themselves with a new swagger, an unshakable arrogance born from the belief that they were untouchable. This sense of impunity would prove to be a fatal inheritance. The shadow of their family name, which had once been a shield, was slowly transforming into a target. The community did not heal. It curdled. The riot had been a political earthquake, and the fault line ran straight through the heart of the county. The old, easygoing relationships between neighbors were replaced by a quiet, watchful tension. People were careful about what they said and who they said it to. You were either a friend of the Allens or you were an enemy, and everyone knew that being their enemy was a dangerous proposition. The county wasn't rebuilding. It was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The silence in those hills wasn't peace. It was the quiet of a long, drawn-out ceasefire. And while the Allens reigned supreme in their hollers, a different kind of power was consolidating in the towns. The court, the sheriff's department, the Commonwealth's attorney, they had been humiliated, but they had not been broken. They were learning, adapting, and waiting. The power dynamic in the region had shifted into a precarious and deadly balance. On one side was the visible personal power of a clan patriarch. On the other was the slow, patient, and institutional power of the state. Both sides believed they were right, and both were now utterly convinced that the other could only be dealt with through force. The stage was being set for a final, tragic resolution. Today, the town of Independence is quiet. The old Grayson County courthouse still stands, a stately brick building that keeps its secrets well. People walk its halls on county business, their footsteps echoing where Wesley Edwards once roared his defiance. Tourists might admire its architecture, never knowing they're standing on a battlefield where the law of the state and the law of the clan met in a blaze of gunfire. But if you stand there long enough, on a quiet afternoon, you can almost feel it, a faint, lingering echo of the chaos, the ghost of a moment when this temple of order was consumed by pure, unadulterated mountain rage. If you know where to look, you can find the other physical remnants of this story scattered across the hills. The old Allen homesteads are long gone. The cabins collapsed and reclaimed by ivy and rhododendron, leaving only a few tumble-down chimney stacks standing like lonely tombstones in the woods. And in a quiet cemetery, you can find the final resting place of Floyd Allen himself. The name on the weathered stone is simple, giving no hint of the storm that was his life. Here lies the king whose kingdom turned to dust, a silent testament to the fact that no man, no matter how powerful, can hold back the tide of the world forever. But the true legacy of the Allens isn't carved in stone or preserved in brick. It lives in the stories. The tale of the Independence riot and the more famous Hillsville massacre that followed has been worn smooth by a century of telling, transformed from a raw news event into a piece of local folklore. It's a cautionary tale told to hot-headed young men about the dangers of pride. It's a ballad of defiance sung by those who still feel a kinship with the old ways. Depending on who you ask, Floyd Allen is either a cold-blooded killer who got what he deserved, or a tragic folk hero who was the last king of the mountains. The man is gone. The clan's power is broken. But their spirit, that fierce, uncompromising and violent spirit of the old Blue Ridge, has not vanished completely. It haunts these mountains still. You can hear it in the stories told on front porches as the evening mist settles in the hollers. You can feel it in the deep-seated distrust of authority that still lingers in the hearts of some. Floyd Allen is dead, but the ghost of his name and what it stood for remains a stubborn whisper in the wind. So we come back to the question we started with, the one they still ask in the quiet corners of these mountains. Was Floyd Allen a hero or a villain? The truth is, he was both, and he was neither. He was a hero by the code of a world that was already dying, a world where a man's honor was his own to defend. By that ancient law, he was a righteous king protecting his domain. But he was a villain to the new world that was being born, a world of statutes and courtrooms that had no room for kings. His tragedy was not that he was evil, but that he was born a century too late. In the end, the Ballad of Floyd Allen isn't just a tale of mountain justice and courtroom gunsmoke. It's a profound and timeless story about how a man's greatest strength can become the very engine of his destruction. That unbending, iron-willed pride was the forge that created him. It made him a leader, a provider, and a protector. But that same pride blinded him to the changing world, and it would not allow him to bend, even when breaking was the only other choice. His story is a warning, etched in blood and gunpowder, that no man can stand alone against the turning of the tides. You cannot fight the future with a pistol, and you cannot hold back the world with the force of your will alone. And that, my friends, is the ballad of a man who tried to be as unmovable as the mountains themselves, only to discover that even the mountains, given enough time, must crumble into dust.